Bob Dutko is a popular conservative Christian radio talk show host. He reminds me a lot of Rush Limbaugh for his punchy delivery and his ability to communicate effectively. But what he communicates and the way he does it is, in my opinion, not only horrendously subjective, but downright dishonest. For example, Dutko asserts his conservative Christian belief that the age of the earth is only thousands of years old instead of billions, and that dinosaurs and man coexisted.
Dinosaurs is a great example of that. I could spend all day talking with you about dinosaurs, but the only reason I want to address that right now very briefly is because this is one of the things the skeptics will bring up, big time. Are you really crazy enough to believe that dinosaurs were walking the earth with human beings just a few years ago, a few thousand years ago? That when Jesus walked the earth, there were dinosaurs walking the earth? You'll get laughed at for believing that. But what if the evidence proves that to be true? I'll tell you some stuff that, again, you're never going to read this in your school history books or your school science books, but everything I present to you is verified, public, documented information. You can look it up yourself. I've just done all the research for you, but don't take my word for it. Look any of this stuff up yourself. For example, most people don't know that dinosaur bones have actually been carbon dated. Now, an evolutionist will tell you you can't carbon date a dinosaur bone because dinosaur bones are at least 66 million years old, and carbon dating can only be done on things that are less than 100,000 years old. But carbon dating, when carbon dating is done on something, how they measure carbon dating is to determine how long ago something died, because once it's died, it no longer takes in more carbon-14. So the carbon-14, it decays to nitrogen-14. Bottom line, you reduce the amount of carbon-14 in something, so it gets less and less and less and less. And so therefore, like this used to be a tree, okay? This still has carbon-14 in it, but it's got less carbon-14 in it today than it did yesterday. And it's going to continue getting less and less and less until eventually, after 100,000 years, any atheist evolutionist will tell you this would have no more carbon-14 left in it, because that's how long it takes until you run out of carbon-14. So therefore, a dinosaur bone, if that dinosaur bone is 66 million years old, which is when we're told the dinosaurs went extinct, that means that bone should have run out of carbon-14 65.9 million years ago, right? I mean, I'm no mathematician, but let's just be honest. So what do you do if you carbon date a dinosaur bone and it still has not just a little bit, but a whole lot of carbon-14 still in it, and in the process is still draining out? Do you see how that would be actual scientific proof that those dinosaur bones are no more than just a few hundred, a few thousand years old at the most? Well, did you know that dinosaur bones have been carbon dated by the top radiometric dating laboratories among the evolutionists in not just America, but in the world? And every single one of them dated those bones to only be a few thousand years old. They were still filled up with a whole lot of C14 still in the process of draining out.
I strongly suspect it is not, as Bob so confidently claims, still in the process of draining out, but is rather simply characteristically contaminated. Here's some relevant information I found. While radiocarbon dating can be used on bone, it is not effective for dating dinosaur bones due to their age. Radiocarbon dating is only useful for materials younger than approximately 50,000 years old, whereas dinosaur bones are millions of years old. Additionally, bone undergoes recrystallization, which can introduce new carbon and skew the results, making it appear younger than it is. And evidence from isotopes other than radiocarbon shows that dinosaur fossils are indeed millions of years old. Fossil bone incorporates new radiocarbon by means of recrystallization and, in some cases, bacterial activity and uranium decay. Because of this, bone material, fossil or otherwise, is a material that cannot yield an accurate radiocarbon date. Similarly, the so-called collagen fraction of Mesozoic fossil bone yields a falsely young date due to the presence of organic contaminants. Even a little extra carbon from contamination will throw off the results significantly. I highly distrust Bob's assessments. His broad supposition that the scientific community is culturally conditioned to be subjective is patently untrue. It is culturally conditioned to be objective. It's religious communities that are subjective. Religions throughout the world are different, and they get away with just making claims, whereas science throughout the world is the same and has to demonstrate that what it says is true. Bob goes on about dinosaurs.
When we say dinosaurs were created on days 5 and 6 of creation 6,000 years ago, they walked the earth with human beings. They went on Noah's Ark about 4,500 years ago. Most dinosaurs aren't that big. There's only a handful of them that grew to big sizes, and I think God would be smart enough to send those as babies when he got to Noah's Ark.
I am not a scientist, but I've watched enough nature programs to know that very young animals need to learn how to survive from their parents, how to forage, how to hunt, how to stay safe, etc., etc. Claiming that the big animals on the ark were very young and not really so big is not a realistic solution to the ark capacity problem. And what did the last two T-Rexes eat when they got off the ark? The last two gazelles?
If you go over to Cambodia, there's a tourist attraction. There's a jungle temple from the Khmer civilization 1,100 years ago. And they have carved into the stone pillars a bunch of different animals from 1,100 years ago. One of them carved in there is a stegosaurus. How'd they know what a stegosaurus looked like? I mean, remember that the science of paleontology and creating dinosaur skeletons, that didn't start developing until the 1800s. So, and to excavate these bones from rock is a slow, meticulous process. It didn't begin until the 1800s. First dinosaur skeleton wasn't constructed until then. So, if evolution is true, those dinosaur bones have been buried, embedded in rock for 66 million years, invisible to the naked eye. Nobody walks along and sees a stegosaurus skeleton laid out. How'd they know what they look like?
They didn't. That is not a stegosaurus. First of all, if you look at the context of that carving, it seems to me that those supposed backplates are very likely the very same artistic motif that appears throughout the carvings. Or at least if they were meant as backplates, they would not have separation between the plates and the back of the animal. Like this one down here, where the plates come directly out of the back of whatever fanciful animal this is. And note that the bottom figure here is clearly a mythological creature and not a real animal. So these carvings do not necessarily depict real animals. Secondly, stegosauruses have a double row of backplates, not a single row. Thirdly, a stegosaurus does not have external ears. Fourthly, a stegosaurus has a small head, not a big head. Fifthly, a stegosaurus has a signature spiked tail. This animal does not. No self-respecting sculptor would have failed to include this unusual feature. Sixthly, the stegosaurus's tail is up off the ground, not sloping down to the ground. If the sculptor had seen an actual stegosaurus, he would not have made this mistake. This alleged proof Bob offers is not just weak, but downright dishonest. And finally, something I am proud to have come up with myself, giant dinosaurs like T-Rex could not have existed with humans, because that would contradict what Dutko's own scripture says about the dominance of lions. Proverbs 30:30 says, "A lion which is mighty among beasts and does not turn away from any." Does not turn away from any. Are you telling me a lion will not turn away from a T-Rex? Last summer I was at a zoo and I read this Proverbs passage about the lion's dominance to an elephant, and he immediately started laughing hysterically. There is an atheist named Brett Palmer who has a YouTube channel called The Bible Skeptic. He has some insightful things to say about Bob and his confrontation with another atheist, Aaron Ra.
On this same program with Aaron and Dutko, the conversation veered from the intended topic and drifted toward a discussion about dinosaurs living alongside human beings. That was when Bob was able to use an old debate trick.
You give me one single example that you will announce on here that can be scientifically verified to be authentic and be a human, a pre-Columbian human representation of a dinosaur, or whatever you want.
I can give you over 30 of them right now. I could give you over 30 of them. Let me give you, just one or two. For example, in the Arizona Historical Society, ancient swords were excavated near Tucson, Arizona. They were excavated in 1924. The swords are referred, by the way, on page 331 of the book Lost Cities of North and Central America. You can look it up for yourself. They have various artwork designs carved into them. One sword has an exact brachiosaurus carved into it. If you look at this, you can show it to anybody. It looks exactly like it came out of a Jurassic Park movie. The Arizona Historical Society owns the sword. You can look at that picture of the brachiosaur. There's nothing ambiguous about it at all. You can't say, the ears aren't right. Nothing along those lines. That's one of example of 30 of them that I can give you right now. I would encourage you to look that up. You asked me to give you one, that's one. If you want two, I'll give you two. You want three, I'll give you three. We could spend all afternoon as I go through those.
On radio, or even in a live debate, an apologist can throw out a reference, like the one Dutko made to this Arizona sword with the carved brachiosaur, and the apologist's opponent, in this case Aaron Ra, has no opportunity to look up the reference, research it, and see if it supports the claim the apologist is making with it. So, by merely making the unsupported assertion regarding the so-called sword depicting an engraving of a dinosaur, Dutko wins debate points, because Aaron is made to look like a skeptic who can't respond to the evidence raised by the apologist right as the reference is being made. And while Dutko encouraged his listeners to check into his reference, how many will actually take the time to get it appraised by an informed, independent source and not simply rely upon the word of the apologist? When they look at the sword, will anyone be there to point out that only reptiles like snakes and lizards have forked tongues and not dinosaurs? Who will notice that Bob's book was published by Adventures Unlimited Press, a bookseller which also produces and markets books about Atlantis, UFOs, and Bigfoot?
One of Bob's arch enemies is atheist podcaster Aaron Ra. I have followed Aaron for years, and I respect both his knowledge and his honesty. I disagree with him on the question of God's existence. I think some God makes more sense than no God. I believe in the probability of a general God who is non-intervening and is not tied to any particular religion. But I absolutely agree with Aaron that Christianity is an untrue belief system. Here's part of the confrontation between Bob and Aaron, followed by Aaron's analysis of Bob's claims.
You give me one single example that you will announce on here that can be scientifically verified to be authentic and be a human, a pre-Columbian human
I'll give it to-
representation of a dinosaur, whatever you want.
I can give you over 30 of them right now. I could give you over 30 of them. Let me give you, just one or two. For example, the Arizona Historical Society owns the sword. You can look at that picture of the brachiosaur. There's nothing ambiguous about it at all. I would encourage you to look that up.
Oh, I did. And I'm so glad that I did. Never trust a creationist when they tell you what the evidence shows or what some study says, because whenever you look it up for yourself, it never says what they said it would. Dutko referred me to a collection of crude, homemade sword replicas made out of lead. That's right, lead. Not steel or bronze or iron, but something that would be utterly useless as a sword. In 1924, this collection of sword replicas were secretly dumped into an already excavated hole and covered over with soft dirt, apparently in the hopes that they would be discovered by archaeologists who would be working that site. But it gets funnier than that, because some of these sword-shaped slabs of lead had Latin and Hebrew inscriptions crudely scratched onto them, with some kind of indication that they were supposed to belong to Roman Jewish immigrants from the 7th century. And that's what Dutko believes they are. However, when linguists took to studying these inscriptions, they saw that they didn't make any sense in either language. And it turns out that most of the lines were copied verbatim from 3 textbooks teaching Latin language. And all of these texts had been published by 1908. So these were not pre-Columbian artifacts like Dutko said they were. No, they were all from the 20th century. But it gets even funnier than that. Because remember, Dutko said that one of these cheap-ass fireplace decorations bore an image that he said was an exact depiction of a Brachiosaurus that looked like it came out of a Jurassic Park movie, when really, it was a childlike line drawing that looked like Fred Flintstone's Brontosaurus, except that it had a forked tongue, because these swords were made back when people thought that dinosaurs were giant lizards. And best of all, remember that I challenged Bob Dutko to give me one single example that he would stand behind, that he would announce on the air that can be scientifically verified to be an authentic pre-Columbian representation of a dinosaur. So what was the one artifact that Dutko thought he could trust enough to stake his reputation on? A childish and stupid, obvious prank. Well, obvious to everyone but the deluded believers. His best example of what could be proven true had already been exposed as a hoax 100 years ago. That's how out of date and out of touch with reality he is.
That's public information, but censored in the media and censored from the school books.
No, it's not censored anywhere. It's publicly available. Google it. It's just that those who suffer confirmation bias won't learn what they don't want to know. And reality doesn't tell the same lies that believers tell themselves. They're pretenders, literally fooling themselves, trying to make believe what they know or should know, and sometimes do know, is not really real. They see what they want to see, even when it isn't there.
Bob's quote-unquote proof is highly, highly suspect, and that was the best example that he chose to cite.
That hundreds of years before Jesus came in history, you had real human beings writing down predictions about what he's going to do. For example, it was prophesied hundreds of years before Jesus came along that the Messiah would be born specifically in Bethlehem.
No, that is a phony prophecy. It's just a connection deliberately drawn by the New Testament writers. That cannot be a valid prediction of Jesus, because that predicted Messiah in Micah was supposed to be a military leader, and Jesus was not a military leader.
That he would practice miracles and healings, that he would be betrayed by a friend, that he would be betrayed specifically for 30 pieces of silver. How'd they know that hundreds of years before?
I would say they didn't know it. They simply wrote it that way after the fact. The writers wrote the New Testament based on mining the Old Testament for ongoing ideas, drew the connection, and then claimed, "Look at that, a prediction fulfilled." How is this in any way a prediction fulfilled? The stories of Zechariah and Judas are widely different. Picking out one similar element, the 30 pieces of silver, does not equal a prediction fulfilled.
Oh, by the way, Psalm 22:16 says his hands and feet will be pierced. Okay, just so you know, in all of human history, talk to any atheist historian, they'll confirm this. In all of human history, there is only one method of execution ever that pierces hands and feet, and that's crucifixion. Okay? And so in Psalm 22:16, it was predicted that the Messiah would have his hands and feet pierced. Here's the only problem. Psalm 22:16 was written about 1000 BC. Any atheist historian will tell you that. Crucifixion wasn't invented until 300 to 400 BC. So this was written 600 to 700 years before crucifixion was even invented.
Who says Jesus' crucifixion was predicted in the Old Testament? The Hebrew word translated as pierced means clawed at like a lion or mauled. It does not necessarily mean pierced with nails. That is just a similarity noted, not a specific prediction fulfilled. Not to mention that Psalm 22 is David writing about himself, not some other person, Jesus. And it is written in the past tense. Psalm 22:16, they pierced my hands and my feet. A prediction is supposed to be written in the future tense. This is just roughly similar elements deliberately cherry-picked from one story and applied to another story without regard to context in order to advance a religious movement. What appalls me about Christians is how they routinely ignore elements that do not match. The big one here in Psalm 22 is the fact that the writer is pleading with God to save his life. That cannot be Jesus, because Jesus, as Bob notes elsewhere, Jesus intended to be killed and then rise 3 days later. But the writer of Psalm 22 is pleading not to be killed. He's begging for his life to be saved. How is this supposed to be Jesus, who knew and accepted that his fate was to be killed?
So, I mean, there's just so many little things like this that make it impossible for the skeptic to believe that these are just mythological writings from people. Nobody gets everything right like that.
First of all, the Bible has many wrong prophecies. Secondly, just because people write about fulfilled prophecies, that does not mean they actually happened. And thirdly, anyone can write a book with, say, 100 prophecies and see that 50 of them did not come true, and then simply edit out all the ones that did not come true. And there you go, a book with an amazing fulfillment rate. I'll never forget talking to a minister years ago, a liberal minister. I asked him if he was impressed by biblical prophecy, and he said no and rolled his eyes and said, yeah, well, we could write it that way too if we wanted to. Exactly.
At the time the Bible was written, it was believed that the earth, especially in the Old Testament, was flat and sat upon pillars of a kind. That was common knowledge at the time, people believed. But Job 26:7 says he suspends the earth upon nothing.
Yeah, the Bible happened to get it right in Job, but it doesn't mean it's divine foreknowledge. It could be just a fair guess, as the writer sees the sun go down on one side of the planet and come up on the other side in the morning. But in two other verses, the Bible claims the earth is set on pillars. Bob gladly quotes the Job verse, but ignores the other two verses. You see what I mean by his trafficking in half-truths? Logically, it can't be both pillars and nothing.
He was crucified under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. The sky grew dark during his crucifixion. There was an earthquake.
The Romans were careful historians. How come they did not record this alleged earthquake? Bob might respond that the Romans could very well have deliberately left it out in order to better quash the Christian movement. And I would respond, okay, that's possible, but likewise, the Bible writers could very well have deliberately put it in. So it's not really good proof of anything.
Everything I just read to you comes not only from non-biblical sources, but hostile, anti-Christian sources from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, but those non-biblical sources are not original manuscripts. They were copied through the centuries, and there is considerable debate on exactly what was written, or exactly what was in the originals. For example, for Josephus, Wikipedia has this to say. As is common with ancient texts, however, there are no known manuscripts of Josephus's works that can be dated before the 11th century, and the oldest which do survive were copied by Christian monks. More importantly, for her, instead of "he was the Messiah," as in the Greek Testimonium, Jerome's and Michael's versions both read "he was thought to be the Messiah." Josephus, as a Jew, would not have claimed Jesus as the Messiah, and the reference to "he was the Christ" in the Testimonium must be a Christian interpolation. Those non-Christian authors may be confirming the existence of Jesus, but they are not confirming that what he taught is true. Tacitus called Christianity a most mischievous superstition. Pliny wrote that Christianity was a depraved, excessive superstition. These writers do not confirm Jesus' divinity, but only his existence and his movement. Yet Dutko presents their writings as somehow a confirmation of Jesus' divinity.
You know, I remember there was a friend of mine, not a Christian. I was having a discussion, kind of a friendly debate with him about Jesus. This was several years ago. And I remember him saying to me, "Bob, but there's so many different world religions, okay? You know, how can you know?" And I remember saying to him, I said, "Oh, I'll tell you what, if there was a lake, and I'm on one side of the lake, and on the other side of the lake are the founders of all the world religions. There's Confucius, there's Muhammad, there's Krishna, there's Buddha. We'll say there's Jesus, okay? They're all over there, and they're all hollering across the lake to me, 'I have the truth. No, I have the truth. No, I have the truth. No, I have the truth.' And then one of them says, 'I'm not going to yell,' and starts walking across the water to me. I'm like, the rest of you might as well shut up. I'm listening to this guy." Okay, and so I remember my friend said, "Oh, so the one who does the miracles is right?" And I thought about it a second, and I went, yeah, yes. The one that can walk across the water is right. The one that can walk out of the tomb after 3 days is right. That's who I'm believing.
No, Bob, you are not believing in the one you see walking on water. You didn't see Jesus walking on water. You're believing in a story that people wrote thousands of years ago. You are assuming their miracle claim is true, just as people of other religions assume their miracle claims are true. Are you going to believe Catholicism is true because so many claim to have been miraculously healed at Lourdes? Are you going to believe that Islam is true because Muslims claim that Muhammad flew to heaven on a horse with wings? Are you going to believe in the worldview and wisdom of a man who jumped over a couch, or a man who jumped over a building? Well, certainly the man who jumped over a building, logically so, because that man can breach the laws of nature. But that's the whole point. That man did not jump over a building. That's just a claim. He's just telling stories like so many humans have throughout history.
Let's see. There have been, I know this is a tough one to skeptics bring up. Okay, I get it. There have been a great multitude of babies and children who have died in the flood of Noah's day. How do you justify that to a skeptic? Was it God's mercy rather than allowing them to grow up in a world dominated by evil or such? The truth is, there's not a short, easy answer to this.
I think there is a short, easy answer to this, namely that the biblical God, who shows not one iota of compassion to the millions of innocent children and animals he drowns, is not a God worthy of worship. Bob claims starting over means starting over. But the point is that there is no reason why the biblical God could not have started over by making the rest of humanity and animals outside the ark simply go poof. There is no need to drown them all. Bob goes on to make the point that we have limited perspective compared to God's unlimited perspective.
That God, I believe that he realizes at that time that what is best for humanity is to basically start over. And starting over means starting over. With Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their 3 wives. And I know for us sometimes it's difficult for us to wrap our brains around why would God order the killing of the Canaanites and so I know that these are very difficult things for us to understand. Okay? So yes, there will be things about God that can seem confusing to us and seem harsh to us. And I have no doubt that someday I'm going to get to heaven and go, now I understand why those children had to die. Now I understand why everybody needed to be wiped out among those particular peoples. Now that makes perfect sense to me. It sure didn't make sense to me when I had limited understanding.
It makes no sense to me that drowning millions of innocent children and animals unnecessarily is the right thing to do. And I don't need unlimited perspective to understand that. If we are, from the Christian's own scripture, made in the image of God, and we reflect God's nature in some profound way, then positing such a cruel perspective that differs so radically from our own sincere perspective cannot represent a valid concept of a fair and loving God.
So, I can try to intellectualize it as best I can. But at the end of the day, for me, it's like, Lord, I trust you. You're God. I'm not. That's good enough for me.
Not for me. A God of such thin compassion is not good enough for me.
And then say that he will rise from the dead himself after 3 days, and then do just that and hang around for 40 days in front of 500 brethren, not counting women and children, documented in history by eyewitnesses that were there.
Sounds impressive. Documented in history, 500 witnesses. But there is a huge difference between 500 verified witnesses and one man saying there were 500 witnesses. One writer with a religious agenda claiming 500 witnesses from 2,000 years ago is not at all convincing to me. The Book of Mormon has much, much better alleged evidence. At the start of the book, 11 identified people swear they witnessed the golden plates and an angel. You can even find actual photographs of these specific people. Yet no mainline Christian is going to be persuaded by the Book of Mormon's alleged documented evidence. And that leads me to my final point on Dutko's half-truths. He makes a big deal about the fact that there are far more surviving manuscripts of the New Testament than any other ancient manuscript. Right. But that is evidence that the subject matter was popular. It is not evidence that the subject matter is true. Yet again, Bob is arguing in half-truths. Thanks for watching.